In the late summer of 1977, a young policewoman assigned to patrol the peaceful streets of a small coastal town in California vanished during what should have been an ordinary night shift. One moment she was checking in via her car radio, and the next, nothing. No trace, no distress call, not even a tire mark left behind. The abruptness of her disappearance fueled countless rumors. Some whispered she had fled her life, overwhelmed by something no one could see. Others were convinced something darker had silenced her. But over time, as years slipped by and leads grew cold, most simply resigned themselves to the idea that she'd chosen to disappear. Then, more than a decade later, in the early spring of 1990, that quiet narrative was shattered. Off the rugged coastline near Devil's Slide, a deadly stretch of Highway 1 where cliffs fall violently into the Pacific, an old fisherman spotted something glinting in the morning sun. Wedged in the jagged rocks at the cliff's base, something long buried had been pulled from hiding by a recent storm. The rust-ravaged remains of a patrol car, its skeletal frame rising grotesquely from the churning tide. That same foggy morning in Pacifica, California, Sergeant Jack Monroe stood in his kitchen, pouring himself a second cup of coffee. The fog outside clung to the cliffs like wet gauze, obscuring the horizon. It had been an unremarkable morning until the police radio on his kitchen counter crackled to life. Unit 23, this is dispatch. We've got a 1054 at Devil's Slide. A fisherman reports a possible law enforcement vehicle down at the cliff base. Immediate response requested. Jack's hand froze in midair. The cup tilted, but didn't spill. Devil's Slide. A place as notorious for accidents as it was for its perilous beauty. Jack knew the terrain too well, having driven that route countless times over his 20-year career. But something in the dispatcher's voice stirred an icy dread in his chest. Dispatch, Unit 23, Monroe, I'm en route. ETA 10 minutes. His breakfast forgotten, Jack grabbed his service jacket and rushed to his patrol car. The driveway blurred beneath him as his tires screeched into motion. A moment later, his radio buzzed again. "Jack, it's Marie," said Detective Marie Estrada, her tone clipped with urgency. "I'm already heading there. Chopper's been dispatched. Meet me at the Northern Observation Post." "What are we looking at?" Jack asked, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. "Fisherman says it's one of ours. Old make, heavy damage." She paused for a beat, then continued. "Dispatch ran a check on missing patrol vehicles in the region. There's only one that hasn't been accounted for in over 2 decades. Jack didn't need her to say more. He knew. The knot in his stomach told him. Laura, his wife, has been missing since 1977. Gone on a quiet evening patrol, her last words a promise to come home. Her cruiser had disappeared as completely as she had. Until now. He drove like a man haunted, each turn etched into memory. The 9-minute, 37-second drive felt like an eternity trapped in reverse. In his mind, images he'd long buried clawed back. Laura's confident smile in uniform, her badge catching the hallway light, her warm breath against his cheek the night she vanished. When Jack arrived, flashing lights bathed the fog in flickering red and blue. A perimeter of yellow tape fenced off the cliff's edge. Officers murmured in hushed tones, clustered near the drop. Beyond them, the Pacific heaved in slow, ominous waves. He spotted Marie standing firm near the tape, her silhouette calm but rigid, dark hair pulled into its usual, no-nonsense bun. "Jack," she said softly when he approached, her voice thick with emotion. "You should brace yourself. The coroner's been called." Jack didn't answer. He pushed past the line of officers and stepped to the cliff's edge. Far below, partially submerged and half hidden by spray, lay the corroded shell of a patrol cruiser. Though distance and rust had nearly disguised it, Jack's eyes locked instantly onto the make and model. A 1975 Plymouth Fury, the same as Laura's. Suddenly the pulsing thud of helicopter blades filled the air. The Coast Guard chopper descended with military precision, its crew already preparing rigging for the vehicle extraction. Beside Jack, an older man stood, trembling, sun-leathered, gray-bearded, his rubber boots coated with seawater. The fisherman. "You found it?" Jack asked him directly. The man gave a slow nod. "Been working these waters for 30 years. That wreck wasn't there last week, I swear it. Storm must have dislodged it from some underwater ledge. When sunlight hit that chrome bumper this morning—" He trailed off, eyes glassy. "I knew something was wrong." "You did the right thing," Marie said. "Can you describe exactly what you saw?" While the fisherman recounted the discovery, Jack's eyes were locked on the crew descending the cliff. They moved efficiently, affixing thick cables to the cruiser's battered frame. The vehicle had been wedged tightly among rocks, partially buried beneath sediment and debris. Any wrong movement could scatter evidence, or send it plummeting into the sea once more. "Beginning lift," came the radio call. All voices hushed. The cables tensed. The metal groaned. Slowly, laboriously, the cruiser rose from its grave. Seawater spilled from shattered windows, driveling like tears. Clumps of rust fell away like scabs from wounded steel. Jack watched, motionless, as the car was guided carefully to flat ground. Up close, it was a mangled relic of its former self. Entire panels had disintegrated, and barnacles clung to every crevice. Yet the paint in places still bore the faded blue of their old department. The forensic team sprang into action, their cameras flashing, gloved hands combing every inch. Jack held himself back, his body screaming to dive in and find something, anything. "Partial plate visible," one tech called out. "Running VIN now." Marie stepped beside Jack again, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "You don't have to stay." His voice was low but firm. "I do." Minutes later, the lead technician looked up from his laptop. His expression had hardened. "VIN confirms it. This is Officer Laura Monroe's unit." The world tilted. Even though Jack had known, had felt it in his bones, he staggered under the weight of confirmation. 13 years of silence, of whispers and rumors, of haunted dreams, all narrowed down to this moment. The technician carefully tried the driver's side door. It crumbled off its hinges, exposing the hollow interior. Shadows clung to the inside like a secret refusing to speak. The vehicle's interior was a wreck of time and salt. The front seats had deteriorated into skeletal wire frames, their upholstery long since rotted away, leaving only rust-stained springs. The dashboard was barely recognizable. Once a collection of dials and switches, it was now a corroded shell, warped and flaking. A tech leaned inside, his flashlight sweeping the wreckage. "No remains visible," he reported after a moment. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Whether it was relief or a stab of disappointment, he couldn't quite tell. A part of him had feared finding what had become of Laura, but another part had needed that certainty. Closure still felt maddeningly out of reach. The search pressed on with quiet determination. Forensics moved through the ruined cruiser with the reverence of archaeologists at a sacred dig. They unearthed artifacts one by one. A flashlight, corroded and warped from years underwater, its batteries bloated and leaking. A citation book, its pages fused into a single sodden block. Each item was handled carefully, tagged and documented. Then, from beneath the driver's seat, something more ominous emerged. A small brass shell casing. .40 caliber, said the tech who found it, holding it up in gloved fingers. "Same as department issue." Jack's jaw clenched. Before he could respond, another voice called out from the back seat area. "Blood," the tech announced. "It's degraded, but definitely blood, under the rear bench." He moved around to the trunk, carefully popping it open. His flashlight danced across rust and decay. "Significant traces here, too," he confirmed grimly. The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a recovery now turned unmistakably into a crime scene. The air grew still as a new voice sliced through it. "What the hell's going on here?" Richard Hensley strode through the police tape as if it were decoration. With his square shoulders and air of command, he looked every bit the department supervisor he was. Jack noted with detached clarity that the years had thickened Hensley's frame and silvered his hair, but the man's presence remained untouched. He had been Laura's supervisor in 777, her last direct superior. "Richard," Marie began, her tone businesslike but cautious, We've confirmed it's Laura Monroe's cruiser. Hensley's face flickered through several emotions. Shock, disbelief, then a tight mask of concern. Christ, after all this time, he turned to Jack. You shouldn't be here. I'm fine, Jack said stiffly. The forensic lead stepped in. Blood and a department-issued shell casing. No dash cam, which isn't surprising given the saltwater exposure, but there's no question this is a potential crime scene. Hensley scratched his chin, visibly unsettled. Let's not rush to conclusions, he said slowly. That blood could belong to anyone. As for the casing, we don't know what happened. For all we know, Laura might have— He paused, clearly choosing his words. Been involved in something that spiraled out of control. Fired her weapon, panicked, abandoned the car. Jack's eyes burned as he stepped forward. That's not Laura, he said, his voice flat and final. She wouldn't. 13 years is a long time, Hensley countered. His tone was measured, but something about it rang hollow. People surprise you. Sometimes they're not who we thought they were. Before Jack could answer, Marie intervened. We'll need DNA confirmation on the blood samples. New protocols, new tech. It'll be expensive, but we'll push it through. Hensley nodded, seeming relieved to pivot. Do it. We'll spare no expense. This could be homicide. He turned and surveyed the scene just as the first news van rounded the corner in a spray of gravel. 2 more followed quickly. In less than 5 minutes, the quiet of the cliffs was broken by the buzz of reporters, camera crews, and shouted questions. Jack found himself back toward the patrol tape as microphones surged toward him like spears. Lights flared. Sergeant Monroe, what's it like finally getting answers about your wife? Was Officer Monroe under investigation before she vanished? Do you believe she was murdered? Jack straightened his shoulders. The cameras were fixed on him, and without notes or preparation, he spoke clearly and with resolve. Officer Laura Monroe was a devoted public servant, he said. She had just been promoted to patrol sergeant at the time of her disappearance in 1977. She was hard-working, honest, and committed to this community. We now have evidence that may finally tell us what happened. We will follow every lead, examine every detail. Nature has surrendered this piece of the past to us. We will not waste the chance to find the truth. More questions came, shouted over each other, but Marie was already beside him, her hand on his arm. That's enough, she murmured. She guided him gently back behind the tape. The forensic team continued their grim task in the background. Every recovered fragment was treated with meticulous care. Jack watched, helpless to do more. You did good, Marie said softly as they neared their cars. You showed restraint. That wasn't easy. I'm not stepping away, Jack said automatically. Hensley reappeared at his elbow. She's right. You're too close to this. Take a few days. Let us handle the investigation. I can work this case. No. Hensley's voice was firm. This isn't personal, Jack. It's protocol. You're emotionally compromised, and that's not a judgment. It's reality. Marie offered a small nod. I'll lead the case. I'll work closely with the forensics team and update you regularly. You can trust me. Jack's eyes drifted back to the mangled patrol car. So many nights he'd imagined this moment, finding some missing piece. But now that it was here, it felt unreal, unbearable. I still have the original case files, he said at last. Notes, records, personal logs. I'll go through them again, see if we missed something. Good, Hensley replied, clearly relieved. But don't go chasing shadows. Marie walked Jack to his vehicle. I'll pull everything from the archives, the 1977 logs, duty rosters, personnel records. We'll find the truth. Jack nodded, but the weight in his chest only deepened. Someone killed her, Marie. All these years, people whispered she ran away, but she didn't. Someone took her life. We don't know that yet, she said, calm but resolute. We follow the evidence. That's our job. Jack climbed into his patrol car. Through the mirror, he watched the team still moving around the vehicle. The past had clawed its way into the present, and now, finally, the search for truth had begun. The drive home was silent. Pacifica rolled past his windows in washed-out tones of sun and fog. His house sat at the end of a quiet street, modest and lived in. He stepped inside without removing his jacket and made his way to the study. Inside the closet, a box waited on the top shelf, one he hadn't opened in 5 years. He pulled it down and carried it to the floor. Written in black marker across its side, E. L. Monroe, 1977. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, spreading its contents before him like relics. Notes, transcripts, photos, each one a possible answer that had eluded them for over a decade. Somewhere in this pile, he hoped, was the piece they'd missed. Jack sat cross-legged on the floor of his home office, surrounded by fragments of a life frozen in time. Laura's personnel file lay open before him, and from it her photograph stared back at him with haunting clarity. Her blonde hair, feathered in the unmistakable style of the late 1970s, framed a face full of resolve. Her eyes, a sharp and vivid blue, held a confidence that made her look older than her 28 years. She wore her newly pinned sergeant stripes with visible pride. The picture had been taken just 2 weeks before the night she vanished. He exhaled slowly and turned his attention to the logbook copies. The entries for November 18, 1977 were written in Laura's tidy, deliberate handwriting. 20 o'clock hours, begin patrol, Sector 7. 15 minutes later, 2015, routine traffic stop, Highway 1, mile marker 42. Warning issued, and after that, nothing. No radio call for assistance, no suspicious activity reported. No mention of trouble, just a wall of silence that had lasted 13 years. Jack shuffled through the stack of witness statements next. There weren't many, just 3. The first was from Officer Patricia Harris, Laura's partner that evening. Her account was frustratingly sparse. She'd last seen Laura at 20 o'clock, when she departed for Saolo Patrol. Patricia had noted that Laura seemed upbeat, even excited, mentioning she hoped to finish her route early and catch a late-night movie at home. The other 2 statements were from civilians. Both had seen a patrol car near Highway 1 that night, but neither could confirm it was Laura behind the wheel. It was maddening. 13 years, and this was all they had? Jack leaned back against the wall and stared at the scattered paperwork. Laura didn't just drive her patrol car off Devil's Slide. The idea defied logic. It wasn't physically possible. Someone else had to be involved. His eyes drifted to the duty roster. Patricia Harris had signed off her own report, but just beneath it, another name stood out. Deputy Carl Bowen, the night shift supervisor. His signature was clean and bold at the bottom of the page, certifying the log entry's accuracy. Jack snatched up his phone and called Marie. She answered on the second ring. "Jack, I'm almost back at the station. Richard's already there, and the forensics team is still combing the scene." "I need to ask you about Carl Bowen," Jack said immediately. "He signed the duty log the night Laura disappeared." "Bowen? Yeah, I remember. He transferred to San Mateo County about 8 years ago. Why?" "I want to talk to him. Can you get his current contact info when you get in?" "Sure. You coming in?" "On my way." Jack gathered the files into the old case box, his movements brisk and automatic. The house felt like a tomb. Quiet, too full of memories. He needed air. Action. But instead of heading straight to the station, he found himself steering his patrol car south on Highway 1. A half-hour later, he pulled onto the shoulder at mile marker 42, the last place Laura had officially been. The world around him was still familiar. Windswept scrub brush, pale coastal grass bowing in the steady sea breeze. To the west, the Pacific stretched out in shifting shades of gray and blue. To the east, the industrial docks of Moss Landing stood rusted and brooding, their corrugated buildings warped by years of salt and weather. They'd searched this area back in '77. Nothing had turned up. No clues, no signs of struggle. But why had Laura been out here alone? Department protocol had always paired officers at night, especially in isolated stretches. Who had approved the deviation? He was about to return to his car when the deep rumble of an approaching engine made him pause. A black and white patrol cruiser rounded the bend and slowed. The vehicle pulled off beside him. The window rolled down. "Jack Monroe? That you?" a voice called out. Jack took a step closer and instantly recognized the face. Carl Bowen. Bowen had aged well. His hair had gone silver, but his features were still sharply defined, his eyes alert and calculating. He wore the San Mateo County Sheriff's uniform with the relaxed authority of a man who'd spent decades in it. "Carl, Jack said, surprised. "Talk about timing. I was just thinking about you." "Yeah," Carl replied, eyeing him. "Heard the news. They really found Laura's car?" Jack nodded. "At Devil's Slide. I came out here to look at her old patrol route." Carl's face clouded for a moment. "Terrible thing. All these years—" He checked his watch. "Listen, I'd love to catch up, but I'm due on shift. I'm working the San Pedro sector today, near Valley Park." "I wanted to ask about the logbook from that night," Jack pressed. "You signed off on it." Something flickered behind Carl's eyes, a barely perceptible pause. "That was 13 years ago, Jack. But yeah, I remember. Everything looked in order, nothing unusual." Carl shifted his cruiser into gear. "Tell you what, let's grab coffee sometime soon. Talk more tea than tea. Call the department, I'm usually around." Jack gave a nod as Carl offered a short wave and pulled back onto the highway. The patrol car disappeared quickly around the bend. Back in his own vehicle, Jack flipped on the radio as he made his way to the station. A local broadcast was playing a snippet from his interview earlier that morning. Officer Laura Monroe was a dedicated member of this department, his voice echoed through the speakers. She had just been promoted to patrol sergeant in 1977 when she disappeared. She was honest, hard-working, and committed to serving this community. Hearing his own words played back, something cold crept into his chest. Laura had been young, newly promoted, and one of the few women in a department still dominated by hardened old-school men, ambitious, respected, and maybe resented. He'd seen firsthand how bitter some of the old guard could become when someone they deemed unworthy rose too quickly. Jack tried to dismiss the thought. These were men he'd served beside, people he'd trusted with his life. But the questions wouldn't stop. Why was Laura alone that night? Who had authorized her to patrol such a remote sector solo? He pressed the accelerator harder. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he had them. When he pulled into the Pacifica police station parking lot, it was mostly empty, midday shift change still an hour away. As he reached for the door handle, movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. Richard Hensley was pacing along the building's side wall, a cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. Even at a distance, his posture looked tense. From across the parking lot, Jack immediately picked up on Richard's agitation. His supervisor moved in sharp, restless strides, pacing a tight circle near the building's rear wall. One hand gripped a cell phone to his ear, the other gestured wildly, slicing the air as he spoke. Though Jack couldn't hear every word, the tension in Richard's voice spiked suddenly, loud enough to cut through the afternoon haze. "I said, get that car out of here. Now! That's your job. Move it!" Jack froze, one hand still resting on the door handle of his patrol vehicle. Richard's tone wasn't just commanding, it was tinged with desperation, as if something urgent had slipped out of his control. Jack quietly stepped out, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Richard must have caught the motion because he spun around, his expression twisting from surprise to something murkier. Uncertainty. Maybe even fear. His voice dropped immediately, and he turned his back, mumbling something into the phone before ending the call. "Jack?" Richard called out with forced cheer, plastering on a strained smile. "Didn't expect to see you. I thought I told you to take a few days." Jack approached, trying to keep his own expression neutral. "Couldn't sit still. Needed to check in. Was that call about Laura's case?" "What? Oh, that? No, just logistics," Richard replied quickly, fumbling to shove his phone into his jacket pocket. "It was the sheriff's evidence yard. They're dragging their feet moving the patrol car. Can you believe it? The thing's been marinating in salt water for over a decade, and now it's an environmental hazard. EPA regulations and red tape. They want it in a specialized containment facility. Problem is, the transport company's being difficult." He gave a short laugh, but it sounded thin and unnatural. "Had to light a fire under them. I told them flat out, your job is to move the damn thing now, before the county inspectors get all over us." It sounded plausible. Jack had handled evidence transport before. He knew how complicated things got with hazardous materials and federal regulations. Still, something in Richard's voice made his stomach tighten. "Bureaucracy never sleeps," Jack said mildly. "Tell me about it," Richard replied, wiping his forehead even though the March breeze was brisk. "Come on, let's go inside." Together they entered the station, greeted by the familiar hum of activity. Phones rang, footsteps echoed, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. The controlled chaos of the bullpen welcomed Jack like an old habit. He scanned the room and spotted Marie immediately, huddled near the evidence processing room with 2 forensic technicians. She glanced up and held up a finger, signaling for him to wait. "Degraded samples are always a nightmare," one tech was saying. "DNA extraction's a precision game, and what we pulled from that car? It's been soaking in salt water for 13 years. Add rust, heat, marine microbes. It's a biochemical mess." "Is there any way to expedite it?" Marie asked, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Not without compromising accuracy," the tech replied. "We confirmed it's blood, sure, but whether it blinded for DNA comparison, we're looking at weeks, possibly months." Jack's optimism deflated. Without solid DNA evidence, proving Laura had been in the car when it plunged off the cliff would be impossible. "What about the shell casing?" Marie asked, pivoting. The second tech flipped through his notes. "Now that's a better lead. It's a .40 caliber. Matches Department Wishy ammo from 1977. Same grain weight, same brand. If Monroe fired her weapon that night, odds are this casing is hers." Jack exhaled slowly. His mind reeled with implications. Laura's blood, her weapon, her car, but nothing definitively tied her to a shooting, or said who had fired at whom. He looked up just in time to see Richard slipping down the hallway toward his office, his stride slightly uneven. Jack turned to Marie, who had just disengaged from the techs. "Sorry," she said, her voice low. "That took longer than I thought." "I need to talk to Richard," Jack said. "It's about Carl Bowen. I ran into him earlier, right at mile marker 42, Laura's last known location." Marie raised her eyebrows. "Seriously? That's a hell of a coincidence." "My thoughts exactly," Jack said. He gave her shoulder a brief tap. "Let me talk to Richard. Afterward, I've got something for you. Meet me in my office." He moved quickly down the corridor, pausing only to knock once on Richard's door. "It's Jack." "Come in." Jack entered to find Richard at his desk, hurriedly pushing something into a drawer. A glass of water sat nearby, next to a small bottle of pills. Richard downed the remaining water. "Blood pressure meds," he said without prompting. "This case, it's a lot." "You don't need to explain," Jack said, though his eyes lingered on Richard's flushed face and the tremor in his hand. "I just had one question, about Carl Bowen." Richard stiffened. "What about him?" "I ran into him this morning on Highway 1, Jack said calmly, "right near Laura's patrol route. He signed off on her log sheet that night." So he was the night supervisor. Laura was sent out alone. That wasn't standard, even back then. She should had backup. Richard looked away. Someone had to sign off on the logs. If she were attacked, she would have radioed for help. But nothing came in after 8:15. It doesn't make sense. "That's exactly why everyone assumed she left," Richard snapped, standing suddenly. "No distress call, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing to suggest foul play. Just silence." "Except now we have blood, and a bullet casing," Jack said firmly. "You can't ignore that." Richard's tone turned sharp. "And you can't go building theories around coincidence. Carl's a good cop. You want to accuse him based on a signature from 13 years ago?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Jack replied. "I just want to know what really happened." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the desk. I have to check on the car transport. Make sure it's handled right." He moved toward the door but stumbled. Jack instinctively caught him by the arm and felt how clammy his skin was, how off balance he'd become. "Jesus, Richard, are you okay? You need coffee? Food?" "I'm fine," Richard said quickly, pulling away. "My wife's got me on some ridiculous diet. Low blood sugar, stress. It'll pass." He adjusted his tie, visibly shaking. "What we need now," he added tightly, "is something solid, something actionable, not suspicions. We're not going to start turning on our own." Jack watched him go. He didn't miss how Richard forgot to lock his door, or how he nearly walked into the glass wall leading back into the bullpen. Jack remained in place for a long moment. staring at the desk Richard had just vacated. Something wasn't right, and Jack could feel it tightening around them like a noose. Before Jack could follow up on the strange tension he'd just witnessed, Marie appeared silently at his side. "My office, now," she said, not waiting for him to answer. He followed her down the corridor and into the privacy of her office. Once inside, she shut the door firmly behind them and moved swiftly to her desk, retrieving a sheet of paper from a growing stack of folders. "I was combing through archival files, cross-referencing other cases Laura was assigned in '77, she began, "and I found this misfiled—" Jack took the document she handed him. It was a typed witness statement, but immediately something about it felt wrong. No official department header, no stamp, no badge number, no signature. It was just plain text. Yet the contents were anything but ordinary. It described a patrol car and a white van spotted near Devil's Slide Road on the night Laura vanished. "Where did you find this?" Jack asked. "In a completely unrelated case file," Marie replied, her expression grim. "A residential burglary that took place 3 months after Laura disappeared." She pulled that file too and laid it beside the witness statement. "See? Nothing to do with Laura, no connection at all, which begs the question, why was this in there?" Jack frowned, his eyes scanning both sets of documents. If someone wanted to bury this, why not destroy it outright? Marie lowered her voice. "Maybe they wanted insurance, a backup, something they could retrieve later if needed. Or maybe they just forgot they'd stashed it." She leaned closer. "Either way, someone inside this department knew something, more than they ever said." Jack's gaze fell on the name typed at the bottom of the unsigned statement. Belinda Carlson. "Wait, that name." "I pulled the official version of her statement," Marie said, sliding a second file across the desk. Inside was another witness report from the same woman. This one properly formatted, signed, and stamped. But the content was entirely different. In the official version, Belinda claimed she hadn't seen anything unusual that night. Nothing about a white van, no mention of a patrol car near Devil's Slide. Just the empty reassurance of a witness seeing nothing at all. The same witness, 2 completely different accounts. Jack muttered. "She's still local," Marie said, glancing at her notes. "Fairmont neighborhood. Got an address and a landline listed." Jack checked his watch. "Still time to catch her. Fairmont's only a few minutes from here." "I'm coming with you," Marie said without hesitation, already grabbing her jacket. "Something tells me Miss Carlson has some explaining to do." They left the station quickly, their unmarked Crown Victoria pulling out of the lot as the sun began to dip behind the Pacific horizon. Inside the car, the scent of stale coffee and paper files filled the air. Jack clutched the 2 statements in his lap, thumbing Belinda's number into his phone. "Come on, pick up," he muttered as the line rang. After 4 attempts and no answer, he snapped the phone shut. "Deadline disconnected or she's not answering." "We're close," Marie said, turning onto Monterey Road. "Fairmont's quiet, blue-collar neighborhood, post-war bungalows mostly." The streets were calm, lined with modest houses and aging sedans in driveways. Jack read aloud from the address, 2847, 2851. "There." Marie eased the car to a stop a few houses down, careful not to draw attention. "Look." In front of a yellow house with flaking paint and a patchy lawn, Richard Hensley's department-issued sedan sat parked. And there he was, tanning on the porch. He wasn't alone. A woman stood opposite him, likely in her early 40s, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her stance was defensive, eyes wary. Marie killed the engine. Through the windshield they watched in silence. "What the hell is he doing here?" Jack whispered. They watched as Richard pointed at the woman, his voice clearly raised, though they couldn't make out his words. His body leaned forward, aggressive. The woman, presumably Belinda Carlson, shook her head, retreating slightly toward her front door. Then Richard reached into his jacket and produced what looked like a thick envelope. He pressed it into her hands, leaned in close, and said something that made her flinch visibly. "That doesn't look like an official interview," Marie muttered. Richard turned sharply and headed back to his vehicle. Jack and Marie ducked instinctively as he passed, though it didn't appear he noticed them. Once his taillights disappeared around the corner, they turned their attention back to Belinda. She clutched the envelope tightly against her chest before retreating into her house, closing the door behind her. "Well," Marie said, already reaching for the door handle, "this just got interesting." They approached the house with measured steps, noting the clutter of mechanics' tools strewn across the porch and the dark oil stains dotting the driveway. Jack knocked firmly. The door opened at once, and Belinda stood there, her expression a mix of annoyance and anxiety. "What now?" she snapped. But the moment she saw Jack and Marie, two unfamiliar faces, her posture shifted. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Her hands trembled slightly. "Miss Carlson, I'm Sergeant Jack Monroe. This is Detective Marie Estrada, Pacifica Police Department." Her anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a wariness that bordered on fear. "I don't understand. What is this about?" "We'd like to ask you about a statement you gave in 1977, Jack said evenly. "May we come in?" "I don't have any business with you," she muttered, beginning to shut the door. Marie took a step forward. "We saw you speaking with our supervisor just now, Richard Hensley. We're investigating the same case." Belinda froze. Her eyes darted between them and the papers in Jack's hand. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice weaker now. Jack raised the two witness statements, one signed, one not. "We need you to help us understand these." Belinda stared at the documents for a long moment. Her shoulders slumped, and with a weary sigh she rolled her eyes and stepped back. "Fine, come in, but this is the last time I talk about this." The living room was small but well kept, filled with the kind of modest decor that spoke of better years. Family photographs lined the walls. She motioned to the couch, then sank into a recliner across from them, the envelope from Richard still gripped in her lap like a lifeline. "I don't know what you want me to say," she began. "The truth would be a good start," Marie replied gently. "We know you gave two very different accounts of what happened the night Officer Laura Monroe disappeared. We need to know what you actually saw." Belinda gave a short, bitter laugh. "The truth? You think anyone wanted to hear the truth back then?" She rubbed her face with both hands, the weight of 13 years pressing down hard. "I'm so tired," Belinda said, her voice cracking as she stared at the envelope in her lap. "Tired of carrying this burden, these lies, this guilt." Jack leaned forward, gently but urgently. "Then tell us, help us understand." For a long, breathless moment, Belinda didn't move. Then she drew in a shaky breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, the words weighted with memory. "I was driving to work that night, November 18th, 1977. I was a park ranger at San Pedro Valley Park. I worked the evening shift. It was just past 8:30 when I passed Devil's Slide Road. That's when I saw her. A female officer, alone, had pulled over a white van. She was standing outside the vehicle, talking to the driver." She paused, eyes distant. "I didn't think much of it at the time. Cops pull people over all the time, right? So I kept driving." Marie's pen was already moving. "Can you describe the van?" "White, like I said. Older model, probably early 70s S. It didn't have any rear windows. One of the panel vans that contractors use. I remember thinking it looked a little sketchy, but again, she was a cop. I figured she had it handled." Belinda shifted in her seat, the memory pulling her backward. "I got to work, did my usual rounds. It was a quiet night, slow, boring. Around 10 o'clock I called my husband, asked if he wanted to come by and keep me company." She looked embarrassed. "We were young, newly married, and a little reckless. We met up in the park. It's huge. Trails, woods, lots of private places. We parked in one of the back lots, went for a walk. You get the idea." Jack nodded, signaling her to continue. "While we were out there, we heard something," she said. "A noise. It could have been a shout, maybe even a scream, but it was hard to tell with the wind and the trees, the way sound carries out there. It echoes, bounces off the hills. My husband wanted to check it out, so we wandered around, maybe 15 minutes. Didn't see anything, no lights, no movement, just silence." "What time was this?" Jack asked. "Somewhere between 11:30 and midnight. I wasn't watching the time. But when I finally made it back to my post, around 12:30, maybe closer to 1, I saw the van again." She looked up, her eyes suddenly sharp. "Same white van. I recognized it immediately. It was leaving the park, driving slowly like nothing had happened. "You're sure it was the same vehicle?" Marie asked. "Absolutely. It had a dent on the back right panel, crescent-shaped, like someone hit it with a pipe." "You don't forget something like that." Marie and Jack exchanged glances. "Did you report it?" Belinda's expression crumpled. "I tried. The next morning I heard on the radio that a female officer had gone missing, last seen on Highway 1 around Devil's Slide. I drove straight to the Pacifica station and gave my statement, told them everything I'd seen." She clenched the envelope tighter in her lap. But then Richard Hensley took over. He pulled me aside, told me my statement was confusing, unclear. He said the van didn't match any of their known suspects, that it would complicate the investigation. Then he offered to help me revise it. Jack opened the envelope. Inside was a neat stack of small denomination bills, $3,000, 0 cents in total, crisp and tightly bound. "He'll paid you to change your story," he said flatly. Belinda nodded, shame written across her face. "It made it sound like he was doing me a favor, said the fewer complications the better, that the official story needed to be clean, tight. He even said it would protect me, keep me from getting involved in something messy." Marie leaned in. "That wasn't all, was it?" Belinda shook her head. Tears filled her eyes. About a week later, my supervisor at the park found out my husband and I had met up during my shift. Someone made an anonymous complaint. I was fired for inappropriate conduct. After that, I couldn't get hired anywhere else. Word got around. I tried applying to parks all over the state. Nothing." She gestured around the small, cluttered living room. "I had to take over my dad's auto shop. My father was sick, and medical bills were piling up. And every few months, Richard would show up again, always with another envelope. 'For your continued discretion,' he'd say." Marie stood slowly. "Ms. Carlson, we need you to come to the station, make an official statement, help us build a case against Hensley." Belinda recoiled, shaking her head hard. "No, absolutely not. You saw him here. He knows something's happening. If he senses he's cornered—" "I understand your fear," Jack said. "But this, your testimony, it could break the case wide open." "It won't," Belinda said firmly. "You think they'll believe me? I'm a disgraced park ranger who got caught with her husband on duty. He's a decorated supervisor with decades of clean service. His word will bury mine." Jack felt the helplessness rising. She wasn't wrong. "I'm not saying I won't help," she said quietly. "But not yet. Find more. Build something real, something he can't squirm out of. Then I'll testify. But not before." Back in the car, Jack slumped in his seat. "She's right. It won't be enough. Not yet." Marie started the engine, her jaw set. "But it's something. A white van seen twice that night. Richard is showing up to pay her off. There's more to this, and it's bigger than just Laura." Jack suddenly sat upright. "Carl Bowen. He told me this morning he was patrolling San Pedro Valley today, the same park where Belinda worked." Marie's eyes narrowed, a sharp glint forming. "That's one hell of a coincidence." Jack shook his head. "It's not a coincidence. It's a thread. Let's pull it." They drove with focused urgency, cutting through coastal roads until the rugged landscape of San Pedro Valley Park opened before them. Towering eucalyptus trees lined the entrance, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Redwoods stood sentinel over winding trails. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. "There," Jack said, pointing sharply. Two vehicles stood near the old ranger station. One, a black and white patrol car, the other, a familiar department-issued sedan. Marie pulled the Crown Vic between a parked van and an old pickup truck, partially hidden by drooping branches. "That's Richard's car," Jack confirmed, "and next to it, Carl Bowen's unit. I checked the plate number, same one from this morning." Marie leaned forward. "We need cover. We don't want them seeing us." She killed the engine, letting the silence settle. Through the windshield, they watched the ranger station. The pieces were aligning, slowly but unmistakably. Two men, two vehicles, one location tied to the night Laura Monroe disappeared. And they were both here. From their hidden vantage point, Jack and Marie had an unobstructed view of the trailhead and both vehicles parked nearby, shielded by the forest's thick curtain. Jack quietly retrieved a folded park map from the trailhead's information box. Spreading it open, he frowned. The trail system stretched endlessly. Hazelnut Trail, Weiler Ranch Road, Middle Peak, thousands of acres of dense wilderness. Finding anything out there would be like trying to locate a single grain of sand in a desert. "We can't just wander around hoping," Jack began, but Marie silenced him with a quick gesture. She pointed through the trees. Two men had emerged from the trailhead about 50 yards away. One in a dark business suit, now rumpled and stained from sweat, Richard Hensley. The other in uniform, Carl Bowen. Carl carried a shovel slung casually over one shoulder and a heavy gear bag. Richard, meanwhile, gripped a large black plastic bag. Not the kind used in kitchens, but the thick industrial type used for hauling construction waste. Their faces were tight with urgency, and despite the outdoor setting, Richard's expression was flushed with a mixture of exertion and fury. Jack and Mary crept closer, weaving through the underbrush, staying low along the tree line for cover. They ducked behind a knot of pine and scrub oak, their ears tuned to the voices that filtered through the forest. "Told you this was unnecessary," Carl grumbled, his voice low but clear. Richard popped his trunk and carefully placed the plastic bag inside a wooden crate. "Unnecessary?" Richard hissed. "Did you even hear Monroe on the news this morning? They found the car, Carl. The goddamn car came up." Carl didn't flinch. He casually loaded his shovel and gear bag into his own patrol cruiser. "So what? It's been 13 years. Nobody's going to connect anything." "There's blood," Richard snapped, the panic barely contained. "There are bullet casings. You think this new DNA testing is a joke? It's real, and it's precise." Carl shook his head, unbothered. "The body's been buried for over a decade. You think they'll find anything but bones?" "Doesn't matter." Richard's voice rose, then dropped as he forced himself to stay calm. "Middle Peak is 2 miles into the backcountry, sure. But now that the car's out of the ocean, they'll start looking. First for the body, then for connections. That ranger woman, the others we've paid off. One of them cracks and we're done." Jack's jaw clenched. Every word was confirmation. Confirmation that Laura had been murdered and buried. Confirmation that it hadn't been a random tragedy or a disappearance. They were looking at her killers. Carl was now leaning against his patrol car, brow furrowed. "Fine, but what do you want me to do with it? I can't drive around with human remains in my trunk. We need a place. Somewhere secure. Somewhere even I don't even know the details of. That way, if I'm questioned or strapped to a polygraph, I've got plausible deniability." Richard rubbed his chin. "What about near those people? Our partners? If anything gets close, suspicion falls on them, not us." For the first time, a hint of satisfaction touched Richard's face. "Now you're thinking. Just get it done. And Carl, make damn sure no one sees you." Both men slammed their trunks closed. Richard climbed into his sedan with stiff movements. Carl got into his cruiser, glancing once around the area before starting the engine. Jack and Marie retreated deeper into the woods, crouching low as the vehicles pulled away. Richard's sedan turned left at the exit road, heading back toward Pacifica. Carl's patrol car went the opposite direction, north, hugging the coastal route along Highway 1. Back at their own vehicle, they scrambled inside. Marie started the engine and waited a full 30 seconds before pulling out behind Carl, ensuring they wouldn't be spotted. "Thank God we didn't have to hike Middle Peak," Marie muttered, keeping Carl's car just within view. "That trail would have taken hours." "That has to be Laura in that bag," Jack said, his voice choked with restrained fury. 13 years. She's been buried in that wilderness alone." "We don't know that for sure," Marie said gently, though the conviction in her tone betrayed that she believed it too. "But whatever they're moving, they're desperate to keep it hidden." They tailed Carl north along the winding highway, past Devil's Slide, the same cursed stretch where Laura's patrol car had reemerged hours earlier. The coastal cliffs loomed to their left, the ocean stretching dark and cold beyond them. Jack watched the patrol car ahead, thoughts racing. Carl mentioned, "Business partners? Who the hell does a dirty cop trust with something this big?" At the Highway 92 intersection, Richard's earlier prediction came true. His sedan turned inland, heading back into town. But Carl continued north, deeper into the remote coastal zones. "He's really going to move a body in broad daylight in a marked patrol car?" Marie said in disbelief. "They've gotten away with this for 13 years, Jack replied. "In a town like Pacifica, where nothing ever happens?" They thought that made them safe. After another 30 minutes of driving, Marie's brow furrowed. "We're entering Sharp Park territory." Jack sat forward. Up ahead, the water treatment facility came into view, a sprawling complex of squat concrete structures and towering metal tanks. Chain-like fences surrounded the property, warning signs posted every few feet. "He's turning in," Jack said, pointing. Sure enough, Carl's patrol cruiser didn't approach the front entrance, but instead veered down a side road, wrapping behind the facility. Marie pulled their car off the highway and into a small lot behind a row of storage units. They parked between a van and an old truck, with enough visual cover to watch without being seen. Carl's cruiser rolled to a stop at the edge of the facility grounds, where the industrial fencing met a stretch of wild, overgrown brush. This area, unlike the neatly manicured grounds of the plant, was unkempt and largely forgotten. Patchy grass, brambles, and weeds growing unchecked. "He's on the move," Jack whispered. They watched as Carl exited his car, opened the trunk, and removed the wooden crate. The thick plastic bag was still inside. He then retrieved his shovel and, after one last glance over his shoulder, stepped into the tall grass. Carl didn't go far, perhaps 30 yards in, but he walked with purpose, clearly familiar with the terrain. His head kept swiveling, checking for surveillance or observers. "Let's go," Marie whispered, already moving. "Stay low." They slipped from their vehicle and kept close to the fence line, using broken equipment and overgrown hedges for cover. Marie's hand rested lightly on her weapon. Jack's eyes stayed fixed on Carl. The man was preparing to dig. From their concealed position behind the fence and overgrown brush, Jack and Marie had a clear, uninterrupted view of Carl Bowen as he moved through the tall grass. He walked with measured urgency, carrying the wooden crate as if it were both precious and damning. When he reached a secluded patch roughly 30 yards from his vehicle, he dropped the crate gently and retrieved his shovel. They watched in tense silence as he began to dig. The shovel bit into the earth with practiced rhythm. Years of physical labor showed in the efficiency of Carl's movements. Each scoop of dirt was flung aside with mechanical precision. Within 10 minutes, a shallow grave had formed, 3 feet deep, 4 feet long. Jack's stomach twisted. His breath caught as Carl pried open the crate and upended the thick black plastic bag into the pit. The contents spilled out in a slow, sickening tumble. Bones, partially decomposed clothing, and what looked like a patch of dark, matted hair slid into the hole. The remains, though degraded, were unmistakably human. But then Carl did something that made Jack's blood run cold. The deputy reached into the grave and carefully selected a small bone, possibly a finger, and slipped it into his pocket. A trophy, a keepsake. Jack clenched his jaw, fury rising in his chest. Carl moved quickly after that, filling in the hole and tamping down the disturbed earth with the heels of his boots. He then scattered the remaining soil, smoothed the top layer, and camouflaged the site with debris and wild grass. Within minutes, it looked untouched, just another piece of wilderness. As Carl loaded his tools back into his patrol car, Jack reached for his radio. "Wait," Marie whispered, catching his wrist. "Think about what he told Richard. Something about placing it near their business partners. He's not finished yet. Let's see where he goes." Jack hesitated, then gave a short nod. She was right. They needed the full picture. Every link in the chain, not just a shovel and a burial. Carl brushed dirt from his uniform and climbed into his patrol car. But instead of leaving through the main gate, he turned into a private access road within the facility, flashing his badge at a disinterested security guard who barely looked up. "He's got authorized access," Marie muttered. "How long has this been happening under our noses?" They grabbed their binoculars again and watched as Carl's patrol car pulled up beside a weathered, rust-streaked structure at the far edge of the compound. An abandoned generator shed. The building looked long neglected. Broken windows had been covered with warped plywood. Ivy curled around the walls and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Carl disappeared inside. 5 minutes passed. Then he emerged, carrying a rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. Both Marie and Jack recognized the shape instantly. "Son of a bitch," Jack whispered. "Narcotics." Marie was already on her radio. Her voice was calm, low. "Dispatch, this is Detective Estrada. I need a quiet background check on the Sharp Park Water Treatment Facility. Look for any reports, complaints, or unusual activity. Don't alert local units yet." While they waited for a response, movement near the shed caught their attention. 2 men had stepped out, both wiry, sharp-eyed, and dressed in mismatched street clothes. But between them they were escorting 2 young girls, no older than 16. The teens wore short, tattered dresses and clutched their arms around their stomachs, their faces pale with fear. The men shoved them forward. Carl met them halfway, grabbed the girls roughly by the arms, and marched them to his patrol car. Without hesitation, he forced them into the back seat, slamming the door shut behind them. "That's it," Jack said, his voice like steel. "We call it in. Now." Marie didn't hesitate. She was already transmitting. "Dispatch, this is Detective Estrada. We have a 1099 at Sharp Park Water Treatment Facility. Officer involved in possible human trafficking and narcotics operation. Request immediate tactical team response. Suspect is Deputy Carl Bowen, San Mateo County. Also requesting units to secure Supervisor Richard Hensley at Pacifica PD. He's directly connected." "Copy that, Detective," came the reply. "Units en route. ETA 5 minutes." They remained in place, watching as Carl engaged in a casual conversation with the 2 men outside the generator shed. The ease of their interaction made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't the first time. This was routine. Then, as if scripted by fate, a white van emerged from the far side of the facility, nondescript, battered, and windowless. Jack's heart pounded, just like Belinda Carlson described. Carl got into his cruiser and repositioned it in front of the van. An escort. A police vehicle, shielding a criminal convoy. The brazenness of it made Jack's fists curl in rage. "They've been doing this for years," Marie said grimly. "No hesitation, no fear, this is just business to them." Sirens pierced the quiet. Red and blue lights painted the trees as multiple patrol units and a SWAT van descended on the facility. The security guard, caught completely off guard, fumbled to open the main gate. Carl and the van driver saw the oncoming police response and panicked. Both vehicles roared to life and bolted toward a secondary exit at the far end of the property. Marie slammed their car into gear and joined the pursuit, tires squealing as she accelerated to catch up. The van driver broke first. He skidded to a stop, flung open his door, and threw his hands in the air. Carl tried to bluff. He pulled his patrol car to a hard stop, climbed out slowly, and held up his hands. "What's going on here?" he called out with mock confusion. "I wasn't notified about any operation. I was just checking the warehouse. Routine patrol." Marie didn't hesitate. She was out of the car, cuffs in hand. "Save it, Carl. We saw everything." "This is a mistake," Carl insisted as she grabbed his arm. "Those girls, they were buying drugs. That's all. Look in the seat. I was bringing them in." Jack stepped in close. His voice was low, deadly calm. "You're quite the storyteller, Carl. Too bad we watched you bury human remains. Probably Laura Monroe. Then waltz over here to collect your narcotics drop and your monthly bonus." Carl's face drained of color. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The only mistake was yours," Marie cut in, reciting his Miranda rights as she locked the cuffs around his wrists. Meanwhile, SWAT breached the generator shed. Jack and Marie followed, watching as officers let out multiple handcuffed suspects. Hardened men, their faces carved with years of violence. Inside, the shed revealed its secret. A stairwell descended into a basement level where the air reeked of chemicals. What lay below was a fully operational meth lab. Industrial-grade equipment, burners, glass apparatus, tanks of chemical precursors. Every inch of the operation was professional, efficient, and highly profitable. It was a criminal empire hidden in plain sight. They found more victims, women of all ages, from frightened teenagers to worn, hollow-eyed women in their 30s, stood huddled in the darkness of the underground complex, their faces pale and haunted. Every one of them bore the marks of captivity: bruises, malnourishment, sunken eyes. Some refused to speak, others stared vacantly ahead, unresponsive. But a few clung to the hands of the female officers who now moved through the space, offering gentle words of comfort. One officer, fluent in Spanish, knelt and spoke softly, reassuring them that they were safe. No more fear, no more pain. The nightmare was over. One of the older women, wiry, strong despite the trauma, was brave enough to speak. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "We worked the lab," she said. "Packaging, cleaning, cooking, whatever they told us." Then she looked at the younger girls, some barely old enough to drive. "Pump them," she continued, her eyes hard. "They kept them for special, for new clients, new partners, and for the police, the ones who helped protect this place. Each month they were given a reward." Jack stepped back from the scene, fighting the wave of nausea that surged through him. This went far beyond corruption. This was institutionalized evil, organized, deliberate, and protected by those sworn to serve and protect. Outside, paramedics began arriving. EMTs carefully escorted the victims into waiting ambulances, tending to them with tenderness that contrasted sharply with the cruelty they had endured. Meanwhile, arrest transports were filling with suspects, hard men in handcuffs, glaring at the officers or staring at the ground. Evidence teams swarmed over the lab, documenting every piece of equipment, every vial, every scrap of chemical residue. "We need to recover those remains," Jack told Marie, his voice tight, "before anyone else steps in and contaminates the site." They coordinated quickly with another officer for support, then drove back to the quiet patch of grassland where Carl had buried the body. The disturbed earth was easy to spot for trained eyes, even in low light. Using Carl's own discarded shovel, they carefully excavated the shallow grave. With reverence and method, they unearthed the remains: bones, scraps of fabric, a rusted police badge. Jack placed them in an evidence bag himself, his hands steady despite the weight of emotion threatening to overtake him. "Dora," he whispered, "we found you." Back at the vehicle, Jack turned to Marie, realization hitting him like a jolt. "We need Belinda Carlson. Her statement ties this all together. She saw the van. She links Hensley to the cover-up." Marie was already dialing. When Belinda answered, Marie's voice was firm but compassionate. "Miss Carlson, it's Detective Estrada. We've arrested Carl Bowen and recovered physical evidence implicating Richard Hensley. There are multiple officers involved. It's time to make good on your promise." A long pause followed, then a breathless response. "Thank God! Yes, yes, I'll come." "We're sending a unit to escort you safely to the station," Marie assured her. Jack grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, I need a unit at 2855 Fairmont Avenue, Pacifica. Protective escort for a key witness. Priority status." They returned to the water treatment facility, which now resembled a war zone. Police cruisers were scattered across the property. SWAT officers stood guard at entrances. Medical tents had been erected to triage victims. Investigators worked through piles of documents, hard drives, and narcotics. Photographers captured every angle of the operation. They had uncovered something monstrous, and it had been hiding in plain sight, cloaked by badges and the illusion of law and order. "Let's get back," Marie said, her tone grim. "It's time we had a real conversation with Richard Hensley." At the Pacifica Police Department, the station had transformed. Suspects were being booked in rapid succession, their chains rattling. Officers moved with professional urgency, processing evidence and coordinating with state and federal agencies. Every available conference room was filled with agents or detectives. Jack and Marie submitted the evidence from the grave, remains, the shovel, high-resolution photos from both crime scenes. Everything was logged into the property room with meticulous care, every item tagged and sealed. The chain of custody, airtight. In Interrogation Room 2, a uniformed officer told them, "Hensley's already inside. The captain wants you both in there." Through the one-way mirror, Jack barely recognized him. Richard Hensley sat at the metal table, handcuffed. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His hands twitched. He looked older, smaller. The confident supervisor was gone. Marie led the way into the room. Jack followed, silently studying the man he'd once called a mentor. "This interview is being recorded," Marie said as she activated the recorder. "Present are Detective Marie Estrada, Sergeant Jack Monroe, and Supervisor Richard Hensley. Mr. Hensley, you've been advised of your rights." "This is a mistake," Richard began, but his voice lacked force. He couldn't even look at Jack. "What we saw," Marie said, calm but unrelenting, "was you delivering hush money to Belinda Carlson this afternoon. We saw you and Carl Bowen exhuming human remains in San Pedro Valley Park. We followed Carl to a narcotics lab where he picked up drugs and trafficked 2 teenage girls. Belinda Carlson has given a full, signed statement about how you paid her to change her testimony 13 years ago." Richard's skin went pale. He looked between them and the wall, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "You followed us?" he said quietly. Jack nodded. "From the park to the treatment facility. We saw it all." The silence that followed was heavy. "What happened in 1977? Jack asked. His voice was low, tired. "What happened to my wife?" Richard stared at the table, shoulders hunched. Then, finally, he looked up. Something in his eyes had fractured. "Fine," he muttered. "You know everything anyway. I'm tired of this, tired of carrying it. 13 years of looking over my shoulder, waiting." He took a ragged breath. "My best chance now is a plea deal, so here it is, all of it." Marie leaned forward, pen poised over her notepad. "Laura pulled over a van the night she disappeared. November 18th, 1977. Routine stop, right near the old industrial docks at Moss Landing. She didn't know the van was running product, meth shipments from the treatment facility." Jack sat motionless, his fists curled beneath the table. "The driver panicked," Richard continued. "Low-level guy, probably high himself. He shot her through the passenger window, hit her in the shoulder. She went down, but she wasn't dead." "You were called?" Marie asked, though it wasn't a question. Richard nodded. "I was already working for them. Had been for 2 years, looking the other way, facilitating transfers. I told myself I wasn't involved, but that night—" He rubbed his face with trembling hands. "I sent Carl, told him to handle it, make sure she didn't talk, but when he got there—" His voice broke. "He wanted to call for help, try to save her, but I—" Richard looked directly at Jack. "I did it. I finished what the shooter started. She'd seen the van, the driver. She could testify. So I used her service weapon. That's why the shell casing matched." The room went silent, save for the low hum of the recording device. Jack didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. "We destroyed her radio and dash cam," Richard continued, each word dragging out of him like lead weights, his features sagging beneath the burden of long buried guilt. "Buried her body in San Pedro Valley Park, Middle Peak Trail, 2 miles in. Nobody hikes that far in, too steep, too dense. That's why we picked it." He exhaled hard, eyes glassy. "The cartel guys, they took her patrol car to Devil's Slide, pushed it off the cliff into the ocean. The storm that week." He chuckled bitterly. "Helped cover the evidence. Wade's carried it deep enough we thought it'd never resurface." Marie's voice cut through his spiral like a scalpel. "The blood in the trunk?" Richard nodded slowly. "From moving her. We wrapped her in plastic, but she was already bleeding out. I didn't think—" He broke off, shaking his head like he could scatter the memory. "We rushed, careless." Jack's hands were clenched beneath the table. His voice came out low and bitter. "All these years, the monthly payments weren't just hush money, were they?" "No," Richard admitted, his face a mask of shame. "Money for some. But not all. Drugs for officers with habits. Girls for the ones who needed something darker. A reward system. Entertainment, they called it. Monthly bonuses for loyalty." His eyes glazed with disbelief at his own words. "The operation grew. First it was just silent backing for the meth trade, then it became more. Trafficking, extortion, protection. I tried to pull away, but I was in too deep." Marie leaned in, voice hard. "Names. We want every name involved." Richard let out a strangled laugh, no humor in it. You want names? If I gave them all, this department would be gutted to the bones. You'd have maybe 4 or 5 clean cops left on the floor. He listed them with robotic precision. Sergeants, beat cops, 2 dispatchers, even a training officer. As the list poured out, Jack felt his stomach turn. This was more than a conspiracy. It was a culture, a system, a cancer. No wonder Laura's case was closed so fast, Jack muttered, barely hearing himself. Half the people looking into it were the ones who buried her. He couldn't breathe. The room seemed smaller, hotter. He pushed back from the table. I need air. Marie gave him a small nod, her eyes filled with understanding. Take your time, she said softly. We're not finished here. Jack stumbled out into the hallway. His steps felt uneven, like the ground was shifting beneath him. 13 years. 13 years of doubt, pain, and half-suspected truths now laid bare in minutes. Near the interview rooms, Belinda Carlson sat on a bench, wringing her hands in her lap. She looked up when she saw him. Ms. Carlson, Jack said, moving to sit beside her. I gave them my statement, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Everything. About Richard. The bribes, the threats. I told them everything. Everything. She met his eyes, her own rimmed with tears. I'm so sorry. I knew enough. And I kept my mouth shut. I deserve whatever they do to me. Jack studied her weathered features, saw the fatigue in her shoulders. You were intimidated, he said, threatened, manipulated, and you came forward when it mattered. That counts. Maybe it means immunity, maybe a plea deal, but either way, he reached out and touched her hand. Laura can finally rest, because you found your courage. She nodded silently. They embraced, brief, quiet, and filled with unspoken understanding. 2 people bound by the gravity of what had been lost and what had just been reclaimed. Sergeant Monroe? A forensic technician appeared in the corridor. We need you to identify something. Jack followed the tech into the evidence room. Inside, tables were lined with tagged materials, drugs, weapons, documents, and digital devices, all from the water treatment facility and Carl's vehicle. This way, the tech said, leading him to a separate table where Laura's remains had been laid out with care. Bones wrapped in sterile sheets, tag numbers attached. We'll send the remains for DNA verification, the tech said gently, pulling on gloves. But we found something with her. Thought you should see it first. From beneath a cloth, he retrieved a small evidence bag. Inside, on a delicate silver chain, was a tarnished pendant. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was Laura's. The platinum heart, worn every day of their marriage. The one he'd bought her on their first anniversary. The back, engraved in delicate script, Jack and Laura, forever. His hands trembled as he took the bag. Through the plastic he could still feel the shape of it, still remember the way it sat at her throat, catching the sun. The tears came then. Not hard, not fast, but steady, warm, and overwhelming. This, more than the bones, made it real, made it final. She hadn't run. She hadn't left. She'd been taken from him. The tech stepped away, giving him space. When Jack finally wiped his face, he turned back to the table. Among the remains was one piece tagged separately. We found this in Carl Bowen's pocket, the tech said. A finger bone. He kept it as a trophy. Jack's jaw clenched. These men, they wore badges, took oaths. He touched the bone through the evidence bag. You can rest now, Laura. The tech nodded, his voice quiet. What you did today saved lives. The girls at that facility, they're at Pacifica General now, getting care. Jack drew strength from that. Laura had been stolen, but others had been saved. After signing off on the evidence transfer, he returned to the hallway where Marie was waiting. He gave us everything, she said. Names, supply routes, cash pickups, cartel contacts. Enough to rip this department apart. Good, Jack said. It needs to be ripped apart. Burn it down and start over. Marie gave him a grim smile. It's already begun. Internal Affairs just landed. The DA's office is setting up war rooms. It's going to be a bloodbath, Jack. Politically, legally, practically. "Let it be," he replied. "Justice doesn't come cheap." They walked together down the hall, passing handcuffed officers, silent dispatchers, detectives with eyes wide from what they were hearing. Chaos bloomed around them, but it was the kind of chaos that came from shattering a long-held lie. "The victims," Marie said. "We should see them, take statements, let them know it's over." "Yes," Jack agreed. "Let's go." They stepped into the booking area, watching as more suspects were processed, watching as something broken was finally being held to account. Jack thought of Laura again, her smile, her strength, her last kiss before that night. She had died doing her job, and now, finally, her sacrifice meant something. Justice had cracked through the concrete, just like her patrol car had risen from the waves. Because truth, like wreckage, never stays buried forever.